I think it's come on a huge way. I mean, just sheer numbers of young people.
Camilla thought Edward would stay quiet. She thought wrong. Nobody saw Edward coming. That was her first mistake. And in this family, first mistakes have a way of becoming very expensive very quickly. The estate is still Edward's, and Camilla is still dealing with the consequences. The prince. They underestimated. There is a pattern in this family when it comes to Edward. People look at him, decide he is not a threat, and move on. They have been doing it his entire life. The press did it first. They decided early that Edward was the least interesting Windsor, the one without the drama or the fire or the headline-generating quality that made his siblings such reliable tabloid material. Charles had the complicated love life and the philosophical eccentricities. Anne had the iron spine and the fearless equestrian career and the magnificent refusal to suffer fools in any context whatsoever. Andrew had the controversies that followed him like weather. Edward had none of that. Edward was quiet. Edward was measured. Edward stayed out of trouble and out of the papers and out of the conversations that animated the royal watching world for decades. And so, people stopped paying attention to him. That was the mistake. Edward Richard Louis Windsor was born on the 10th of March in the year 1964 at Buckingham Palace. He was the youngest of Queen Elizabeth's 4 children, arriving 7 years after Andrew and nearly 13 years after Anne. By the time he was old enough to develop a public profile, the older siblings had already established theirs so thoroughly that there was very little space left for a 4th Windsor to occupy, without simply becoming a footnote to the others. He grew up in the long shadow of a very crowded family picture, and learned, early and of necessity, how to exist in that shadow, without being diminished by it. He was educated at Gordonstoun, the Scottish boarding school that had shaped his father, Prince Philip, and his brother Charles before him. It is not a gentle school. It is built on the philosophy that discomfort builds character, and that the removal of privilege in a controlled environment produces resilience that comfort never can. Edward survived it. He went on to Jesus College, Cambridge, where he studied history, and graduated in the year 1986. He then joined the Royal Marines as an officer candidate, which was the expected path for a young royal man of his generation. He did not complete the training. He withdrew from the Royal Marines in January of the year 1987 after 5 months. The decision was immediate tabloid fodder. The press, which had been looking for a reason to define Edward in oppositional terms to the more conventionally robust masculinity of his brothers, found exactly the story they wanted. He was portrayed as soft, as someone who could not hack it, as a prince who had failed the test that the institution had set for him. The coverage was unkind in the specific way that British tabloid coverage of perceived weakness always is, relentless, reductive, and almost entirely uninterested in the more complicated truth of what had actually happened. Edward moved into television production after leaving the Marines. He founded a production company called Ardent Productions in the year 1993. It was not a successful venture by commercial standards. The company produced content that struggled to find its audience and eventually closed in 2002 after years of modest and sometimes embarrassing results. The press had another field day, another failure, another data point in the ongoing tabloid narrative of Edward as the Windsor who could not quite get anything right. What the press was not covering, because it did not fit the narrative they had already decided on, was the work. Because while Ardent was struggling, and the tabloids were enjoying themselves at his expense, Edward was quietly building something that would turn out to matter considerably more than any television production company. He was building a reputation inside the institution for reliability, discretion, and a commitment to royal duty that did not require public recognition to sustain itself. He was doing the unglamorous work, the long-haul charitable commitments, the Duke of Edinburgh's award program, which he took over and expanded with a genuine personal investment that the people running the program noticed and respected. The overseas visits, the institutional engagements, the steady, consistent, unshowy presence at the machinery of the monarchy that keeps it functioning between the big ceremonial moments sound familiar. It should, because Edward and Sophie built this reputation together. Two people operating in parallel in the same register, with the same understanding of what the institution required from them and what they were willing to give it. They are, in many ways, the most genuinely matched couple in the modern royal family, not in a romantic storybook sense, in the deeper and more durable sense of two people who share a fundamental orientation toward the world and toward the work they have chosen to do in it. By the time Queen Elizabeth died in September of 2022, Edward's standing inside the family was considerably stronger than the public portrait of him had ever suggested. The king knew it, Sophie knew it, and the people who worked closely with the royal household knew it. Edward was not the failed, forgettable youngest sibling of tabloid legend. He was a trusted, capable, deeply loyal member of an institution that values those qualities above almost everything else. Camilla did not know it, or if she knew it, she did not take it seriously enough. That miscalculation was the foundation of everything that followed, and what followed was a sequence of events that nobody who underestimates Edward would ever have predicted. The estate was just the beginning. The estate, at the center of everything. Not every piece of land is just land. Inside the British royal family, property is never simply property. It is history, it is identity. It is the physical expression of a family's sense of itself, its past, its continuity, and its claim on the future. The great royal estates are not real estate in the conventional sense of the word. They are statements. They are declarations of permanence in a world that is constantly changing around the people who inhabit them. And when a specific estate becomes the subject of a dispute inside this family, the dispute is never really about the land itself. It is about everything the land represents. The estate at the center of this story is Bagshot Park. Bagshot Park sits in Surrey, approximately 30 miles southwest of London. It is a substantial property, a Victorian mansion, set within grounds that stretch across roughly 50 acres of Surrey countryside. The house itself is imposing without being ostentatious, the kind of English country house that communicates solidity and permanence rather than the theatrical grandeur of the grander royal palaces. It has 30 rooms. It has extensive gardens. It has the particular quality of English landed property that makes it feel simultaneously ancient and livable, rooted in history but not crushed by it. Edward and Sophie have lived at Bagshot Park since the year 2002. They moved there after their marriage, and they have made it, in every meaningful sense, their home. Their children, Lady Louise Windsor and James Earl of Wessex, grew up within those walls and on those grounds. The property has been the quiet, stable center of their family life for more than 2 decades. It is where Edward works. It is where Sophie has built the operational base for her expanded charitable and diplomatic portfolio. It is not just a house they happen to occupy. It is the foundation of everything they have built together, and that foundation came under threat. To understand why Bagshot Park became a target, you need to understand how royal property tenure actually works. Because the public assumption that senior royals simply own the properties they live in is not accurate. Royal residences exist in a complex web of institutional ownership, crown estate management, and royal household allocation that gives individual family members occupancy and use of properties without necessarily giving them the kind of absolute ownership that would protect them from institutional decisions made above their heads. Bagshot Park is a crown estate property. It was allocated to Edward and Sophie as their official residence. That allocation has served them well for over 2 decades. But allocation is not ownership. And the distinction between those two things is precisely where Camilla identified what she believed was an opportunity. The conversation about Bagshot Park began, according to people familiar with the situation, in the period following Charles's accession in September of 2022. The accession triggered a wholesale review of royal property allocations across the estate. Who was living where? Who needed what? How the physical infrastructure of the monarchy should be reorganized to reflect the new shape of the institution under a new king. These reviews are normal. They happen with every change of reign. They are administrative in their framing and deeply political in their execution. Camilla engaged with this review process in ways that went beyond what most people inside the household expected. Her interest in Bagshot Park was not publicly stated. It was never going to be publicly stated. This is not the kind of ambition that announces itself. It operates through conversations, through the quiet deployment of influence, through the suggestion planted in the right ear at the right moment that a particular property might be better suited to a different purpose or a different occupant. These are the tools of institutional maneuvering inside the royal family, and they are used with considerable skill by people who have been operating in this environment for long enough to understand how they work. Camilla had been operating in this environment for long enough. The argument, as it was apparently framed by those advancing her interests, was ostensibly practical. Bagshot Park is a substantial property. Edward and Sophie, as a couple without the full complement of working royal duties that would justify such a significant allocation of crown resources, might reasonably be expected to make way for an arrangement that better served the institution's current needs. This is the kind of argument that sounds reasonable in administrative language and is devastating in personal terms to the people it is being applied to. Edward and Sophie had spent 20 years building their life at Bagshot Park. Their children had grown up there. Sophie had built her expanded operational base there. The suggestion that they should vacate it in favor of a reallocation that served someone else's interests was not an administrative proposal. It was an attack on the stability and security of everything they had constructed together over 2 decades, and it came from a direction that Edward had not been watching. That is the thing about Camilla's move on Bagshot Park that makes it so striking in retrospect. It was not frontal. It was not obvious. It came through channels that were designed to make it look institutional rather than personal, to make it look like a sensible administrative reorganization rather than what it actually was. A power grab dressed up in the language of efficiency. Edward figured it out, not immediately, but he figured it out. And what he did when he figured it out is the part of this story that nobody saw coming, least of all Camilla. Camilla's play. Every power move inside the British royal family follows the same basic rule. Never let it look like a power move. The most effective operators inside this institution have always understood that the appearance of institutional neutrality is the most valuable cover available to anyone with an agenda. You do not say, "I want that property," or "I want that role," or "I want that influence." You say the institution would be better served if, and you let the logic do the work that ambition cannot safely do in public. You dress the personal in the language of the practical, and if you do it well enough, by the time the person on the receiving end understands what is actually happening, the move is already half complete. Camilla did it well, for a while. The groundwork for her play on Bagshot Park was laid gradually and carefully in the months following Charles's accession in the autumn of 2022. It did not begin with a direct conversation about the property itself. It never does with these things. It began with a broader conversation about the shape of the monarchy going forward, about efficiency, about the responsible stewardship of crown resources in an era of public scrutiny and financial pressure, about the need to align the allocation of royal properties with the actual working requirements of the institution under its new king. These are conversations that Charles was genuinely engaged with. The slimmed-down monarchy was not just a slogan for him. He believed in it as a structural principle. He had watched his mother's reign stretch the institution across too many working royals and too many properties and too many public commitments that diluted the impact of each individual one. He wanted fewer people doing more focused and more impactful work. He wanted the physical infrastructure of the monarchy to reflect that vision. And the people around Camilla understood that this genuine institutional instinct of Charles's could be leveraged. So the conversation about Bagshot Park was framed from the beginning as a conversation about institutional efficiency rather than personal ambition. The property was large. Its occupants, while valuable members of the working royal family, did not require a residence of that scale for the execution of their duties. There were alternative properties that could adequately serve Edward and Sophie's needs. And Bagshot Park itself, with its scale and its Surrey location and its proximity to London, could be put to uses that more directly served the Crown's current priorities. What those uses were, and who specifically would benefit from them, was left deliberately vague in the early stages of the conversation. That vagueness was not accidental. It was strategic. You do not reveal the destination at the beginning of the journey. You establish the principle first. You build consensus around the idea that a change is necessary before you introduce the specifics of what that change should look like. By the time you get to the specifics, the argument for change has already been accepted, and the resistance to it has already been partially disarmed. Camilla's allies inside the household were careful about who they approached, and in what order. They started with the administrative tier, the people responsible for managing the Crown estate allocations, and the practical logistics of royal property use. These are not people who make final decisions. but they are people whose professional assessments carry weight in the conversations where final decisions get made. Getting the administrative tier to produce paperwork that framed Bagshot Park as underutilized or misallocated was the first step, and it was achieved quietly and without attracting attention from the people it was most likely to affect. Edward and Sophie were not initially aware that these conversations were happening. That is the detail that is most significant about this phase of Camilla's play. The conversations were being conducted in spaces that Edward and Sophie did not have natural visibility into. Through administrative channels, they were not routinely monitoring. Through relationships between Camilla's circle and the household machinery that had been cultivated specifically to provide this kind of access. The move was designed to be well advanced before its targets understood what was in motion. It almost worked. The second phase of Camilla's play involved Charles directly, and this is where the operation required its most delicate execution. Because Charles is not a man who responds well to feeling that he is being maneuvered. He has a sophisticated instinct for the difference between advice and agenda. He has spent his entire life navigating a court environment full of people with competing interests, and he has developed, over decades, a reasonably reliable sense of when someone is steering him toward a conclusion they have already reached rather than genuinely seeking his judgment. Camilla knows this about him better than anyone. She has been watching him navigate these dynamics for 50 years. And so, the approach to Charles on the question of Bagshot Park was calibrated with exceptional care. It was not presented as her idea. It was presented as an emerging consensus from the administrative review, something the household machinery had identified independently, something that the people responsible for managing Crown resources had concluded made practical sense. Camilla's role, in the version presented to Charles, was simply that of a supportive voice for a decision that others had already arrived at on sensible institutional grounds. It was elegant, it was carefully constructed, and it was, at its core, a performance designed to get Charles to authorize something that primarily served Camilla's interests, while believing he was simply acting on professional advice. There was one problem with the entire operation. Edward found out, not through official channels, not through a formal notification from the household, that a review of his property allocation was underway. Through something much more human than that, through a conversation. A quiet word from someone inside the machinery who liked Edward more than they liked the direction things were heading. And once Edward knew, everything changed. The moment Camilla's plan started to unravel was not dramatic. It never is with these things. There is no single scene where the curtain gets pulled back and everything is suddenly exposed in the harsh light of full disclosure. What happens instead is quieter and in some ways more damaging than a dramatic confrontation. A thread comes loose. A small detail does not align with another small detail. Someone says something in passing that does not quite fit the official version of events. And the person paying close enough attention to notice begins to pull on that thread very carefully and very deliberately until the whole structure starts to come apart. Edward was paying close attention. The conversation that changed everything happened in the early part of 2023. The person who initiated it has never been publicly identified and is not going to be identified here. What is known is that they were close enough to the administrative process around the property review to understand what was actually driving it. And they were loyal enough to Edward, personally and professionally, to believe he deserved to know. The conversation was brief. It did not lay out the full picture in comprehensive detail. It did not need to. It gave Edward enough. Enough to understand that the review of Bagshot Park's allocation was not the neutral administrative exercise it had been presented as. Enough to understand that the conclusions the review was moving toward had been shaped by interests that were not institutional in nature. Enough to understand that by the time this process reached Charles in its official form, the framing would have been carefully constructed to make a particular outcome look inevitable. Edward sat with that information for a period before acting on it. This is the detail about his response that reveals the most about him as an operator. A less experienced or less emotionally disciplined person would have reacted immediately, would have gone directly to Charles or directly to the household administrators or directly to Camilla herself with a confrontation that felt satisfying in the moment and achieved very little in practical terms. Edward did none of that. He took time. He thought carefully about what he knew and what he still needed to know. and what the most effective sequence of actions would be to protect his position without exposing the source who had trusted him with the information. He began gathering information quietly. The administrative machinery of the royal household is not as opaque as it presents itself to outsiders. There are documents, there are meeting records, there are internal assessments and correspondence trails that, to someone with the right access and the right questions, tell a story that is considerably more detailed than the official version. Edward had been operating inside this institution for long enough to know where that information lived and how to access it without triggering the alarm systems that a more frontal approach would have activated. What he found confirmed what he had been told and added considerably to it. The paper trail, such as it was, showed a pattern of administrative activity around Bagshot Park that had been initiated from a direction that had no obvious institutional justification. Questions had been raised about the property's allocation that had not come from the routine review process. Assessments had been commissioned that reflected a set of conclusions arrived at before the evidence to support them had been gathered. The fingerprints of the operation were there for someone who knew how to read them. Edward read them carefully, and then he made his first move. Not against Camilla directly, not yet. The first move was to secure his position with the king, before the official version of the property review reached Charles through the channels Camilla's allies had been carefully cultivating. This is the move that Camilla did not anticipate, because her entire operation had been built on a specific sequencing. The administrative groundwork would be laid first, the institutional consensus would be manufactured second, and then the whole package would be presented to Charles in a form that made the conclusion feel like the product of a rational process rather than a personal agenda. The timing was everything. Get to Charles before Edward did, in the right framing, and the outcome was manageable. Edward destroyed the timing. He requested a private audience with his brother, not through official channels that would have been visible to the household administrative tier and therefore potentially visible to Camilla's people. Through the direct personal access that a brother has to a brother, particularly a brother with whom he has maintained a genuinely close relationship across decades of institutional and personal complexity. He got in front of Charles before the official version of the property review did. What he said in that conversation has not been publicly disclosed. The specifics of what passed between the two brothers in private remain exactly that, private. But the outcome of the conversation became visible in what happened next inside the household. The administrative momentum around the Bagshot Park review slowed. Questions that had been moving toward conclusions stopped moving. Assessments that had been heading toward recommendations were quietly shelved. Someone had put their hand up and stopped the machinery. That someone was Charles. Camilla's allies inside the household felt the shift almost immediately. The access they had been using to advance the process became less available. The conversations that had been progressing became harder to progress. The institutional machinery that had been quietly working in their direction stopped working in their direction without any formal announcement or explanation of why. They did not need an explanation. They understood what had happened. Edward had gotten there first. And in doing so, he had not just stopped the play, he had exposed it. What came next was not just defense, it was something considerably more targeted than that. Edward strikes back. There is a difference between defending yourself and making a point. Defense is reactive. It is about stopping something that is already in motion and returning to the position you held before the threat emerged. It is necessary and it is important, but it is ultimately passive. It leaves the person who attacked you in roughly the same position they were in before they tried. They failed this time. They can try again. Nothing has fundamentally changed in the balance between you. Making a point is different. Making a point means using the moment of your defense to communicate something that changes the landscape going forward. It means ensuring that the person who came at you understands, clearly and permanently, that the cost of trying again will be considerably higher than the cost of what they have just experienced. It means converting a defensive moment into a strategic one. It means winning not just the immediate exchange, but the longer game. Edward did not just defend himself. He made a point. The first thing he did after his conversation with Charles was something that looked, on the surface, entirely routine. He accelerated his and Sophie's public engagement schedule in a specific and deliberate way. not randomly, not across the board. He focused the acceleration on precisely the kinds of high-visibility institutional appearances that communicate to everyone inside the royal family who understands how to read these things, that a particular couple is firmly embedded in the working structure of the monarchy and is going nowhere. The timing of this was not accidental. It was a message, and the message was simple. We are here, we are working, we are valued, and anyone who thought otherwise has miscalculated. The specific engagements Edward chose during this period were notable for their institutional weight. He did not fill his diary with the minor charitable appearances that pad out a royal schedule without saying very much about a person's actual standing. He showed up at occasions that required the presence of someone the king trusted with serious representational responsibility. Military engagements, Commonwealth events, formal institutional occasions where the Duke of Edinburgh's presence signaled something specific about the palace's confidence in him. Sophie moved in parallel. Her expanded patronage portfolio, already a statement in itself after the redistribution of Elizabeth's charitable legacy, became more visibly active during this period. She was photographed at significant events. She was deployed on diplomatic engagements that carried real institutional weight. The message being sent by the couple together was coordinated and deliberate. They were not retreating. They were not diminished. They were more present and more prominently positioned than they had been before the play against them began. Camilla's allies inside the household noticed immediately, but that was only the first move. The second move was more direct and more personal in its implications, and it required Edward to use a relationship that he had been quietly cultivating for years without anyone paying particular attention to it. His relationship with William. The dynamic between Edward and William is not one that generates much public commentary. They are not the most obviously connected members of the family. The age gap between them, Edward was born in 1964 and William in 1982, means they grew up in different eras of the family's life and developed their primary bonds with different people. But there is a quiet solidarity between them that has grown stronger in the years since Elizabeth's death. A shared understanding of what the institution requires from the people inside it, and a shared impatience with the people who use it for personal advancement rather than genuine service. Edward went to William, not with a formal account of what had happened, not with a detailed briefing on Camilla's operation against Bagshot Park and the administrative machinery that had been enlisted to support it, with something more calibrated than that. He shared enough to ensure that William understood the nature of what had been attempted, enough to place William in possession of information that would inform how he read Camilla's movements going forward, enough to ensure that the next time Camila or her allies attempted to use institutional channels for personal purposes, William would be watching with a level of attention he had not previously been applying. The effect of that conversation on the internal dynamics of the household was significant and immediate, because William's attention, once directed at something, changes the atmosphere around that thing considerably. The people inside the household who had been advancing Camilla's interests through the administrative machinery suddenly found themselves operating in an environment where the heir to the throne was paying close attention to what they were doing and why. That kind of scrutiny does not require any formal action to be effective. Its mere existence is enough to alter behavior. People who had been moving freely through certain channels became more cautious. Conversations that had been happening openly became more guarded. The operational space that Camilla's people had been using contracted sharply. And then came the move that made everything else irrelevant. Charles made a decision about Bagshot Park that was communicated through official channels in language that was formal and final, and left no room for further administrative maneuver. Edward and Sophie's tenure at the property was confirmed, not reviewed, not subject to ongoing assessment, confirmed. The language of the communication was precise in the way that institutional language is precise when it is designed to close a door permanently, rather than manage an ongoing question. The door closed. Camilla heard it close. And the silence that followed was the loudest thing that had happened inside that household in months. Edward had not just survived the play against him. He had turned it into something that cost Camilla considerably more than she had bargained for when she decided he was safe to move against. She had been wrong about him from the beginning, and now everyone inside the palace knew it. The fallout. When a power grab fails inside the British royal family, the failure does not stay contained. It spreads. It reshapes relationships. It changes the way people inside the institution read the person who attempted it and failed. And it does something that is perhaps most damaging of all in an environment built on the careful management of perception. It reveals. It shows people what you were willing to do when you thought nobody was watching closely enough to stop you. And once people have seen that, they cannot unsee it. Camila has been seen. The immediate fallout inside the household was felt at the staff level first. That is always where institutional shifts register first in this family. The people who work inside these spaces are the most sensitive readers of the atmosphere around them. They noticed the change in how Edward and Sophie were being treated in the weeks and months following Charles's confirmation of their Bagshot Park tenure. The deference that had been quietly withheld during the period when the property review was moving against them returned. And it returned with a weight that communicated something important. These two were not going anywhere, and the people who had assumed otherwise had been wrong. For Camila personally, the fallout operated on two levels. The first was practical. The administrative channels she had used to advance her play on Bagshot Park were now compromised. The people inside the household machinery, who had been willing to facilitate the operation, had been exposed in varying degrees to scrutiny from both Charles and William. Some of them recalibrated their loyalties quietly and quickly. Others became more cautious in ways that made them less useful to Camila as operational allies going forward. The network she had deployed for this particular move was not destroyed, but it was damaged, and damaged networks are slower, more careful, and less effective than intact ones. The second level was more personal and more lasting. Charles knew, not everything, perhaps not the full detail of how the operation had been constructed and who had been enlisted to support it, but enough. Enough to have intervened in the way he did. Enough to have confirmed Bagshot Park's allocation in language that was final rather than provisional. And enough to have done it without consulting Camila first, in the way that a husband might consult a wife on a household decision if he believed she had no agenda in the outcome. That last detail is the one that sits most uncomfortably for Camila, because the manner of Charles's decision communicated something about his awareness of her role in the situation that she cannot easily address without acknowledging the role itself. She cannot go to Charles and complain about how the decision was made without raising the question of why it was made the way it was. And raising that question opens a conversation she does not want to have. So she has not had it. The silence between them on this specific matter is, by accounts of people familiar with the household, total. Edward and Sophie continue at Bagshot Park. They continue building the life they have spent 20 years constructing. They continue doing the work that earned them their position in the first place. And they do it now with something they did not have before this episode began. The knowledge that they were tested, that someone came at them directly and strategically, and that they did not just survive it, they won, quietly, completely, and in the way that matters most inside this institution, permanently. If this story changed how you see the quiet ones inside the palace, drop your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe so you never miss what we uncover next. And tell us that. Did Camila underestimate Edward, or did she simply never see him coming at all?